Hello, good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. It's exactly 90 days since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. And when he first stood on the steps of Downing Street, he promised a government of integrity, replacing constant scandals with competence. The kind of leader who would welcome politics becoming a bit more boring. Well, the problem is, it really hasn't worked out like that. And this morning exemplifies that, with a focus on the taxes of his party chairman and allegations of a loan guarantee to Boris Johnson, arranged by the man he appointed to chair the BBC. Who would want to be the government minister on today's show? Well, in a few moments, we'll be talking to that man. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, will be on the programme this morning. And for Labour, the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, will be talking to us in the studio. Now, there are yet more ambulance strikes in the coming days. Unite members are part of that, and plenty of other action across the public sector. We'll talk to the union's General Secretary, Sharon Graham. And the war in Ukraine is almost a year old. Its impact is being felt by countries across the globe. We'll bring you a stark warning from the president of the World Bank, David Malpass. And after another dark week for the reputation of British policing, we'll speak to the man who investigated the culture at the country's biggest fire service, the former Chief Crown Prosecutor, Nazir Afzal. Well, let's start with that pressure on the government this morning. Labour is calling for the Conservative Party chair, Nadhim Zahawi, to go after what he described as a careless but not deliberate error over unpaid tax and reports that he had to pay a penalty. And the opposition also want an investigation into allegations of loan guarantees worth £800,000 given to former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, arranged, according to the Sunday Times, by the man that he appointed to chair the BBC. Well, both Richard Sharp and the former Prime Minister deny any claims of a conflict of interest. We can speak now to the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. Thank you for being on the show this morning. Now, the last thing that I read before I went to bed last night was a tweet that said, "Thoughts and prayers to whoever is doing the media round tomorrow." Were you tempted to pull out?
Look, I'm the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I am the face and voice of the UK on the international stage. I'm very pleased to be able to come on your show, tell you about what I've been up to on behalf of the people of this great country, and also on behalf of our friends and allies, particularly the Ukrainians who are defending themselves so hard against Russian invasion. So always a pleasure to join you on the show, Sophie.
Now, we will talk about Ukraine, but I'm sure you'll be aware that we do need to start with the serious allegations around integrity and the government. I want to start with a story that's what we call in the business a marmalade dropper. According to the Sunday Times, in 2020, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, Richard Sharp helped him to arrange a guarantee on an £800,000 loan. Now, shortly after, Boris Johnson recommended him for the job of BBC chairman, which he then got. Is that true?
Well, I don't. I've not had a conversation with either of those parties about that situation. I have met with Richard. We discussed the World Service. He struck me as an incredibly competent, experienced, thoughtful individual. And I can see exactly why he has the attributes, both personal and professional, to be the chair of the BBC. So, as far as I can see, his appointment was made on those merits, and he has said, and I take this from the intro that you just given, that he denies there being any conflict of interest. But as I say, I can see the merit, I can see the experience that he brings to the job.
You know, you say that you haven't spoken to Boris Johnson or Richard Sharp. I just really wonder if that's good enough. I mean, you're close to Boris Johnson. You've got his phone number. Why don't you text him?
Well, I'm sure you've got his phone number as well, Sophie. And
I don't
have
actually.
No doubt. You're not? Well, look, as I say, the fact of the matter is that Richard is undoubtedly an incredibly experienced individual, steps into this role with as I say, both personal and professional attributes which qualify him for the job. And we've had senior people in the BBC who have political affiliations. Most people have political affiliations. A number of them are active, so it's not at all unusual to have individuals in the senior levels of the BBC.
Just to jump in, because the problem, the concern here isn't because of political affiliation. The concern people have is that there is a serious report here that Mr Sharp helped to guarantee a loan of £800,000 to a man who then recommended him for the job. And you are saying that you don't know if it's true or not because you haven't tried to find out. And, it might be easy for you to be able to come here and say, look, I don't know, I wasn't to do with it. But it's not great for transparency, is it?
Well, look, you're the journalist, not me. I mean, it's not... my role as Foreign Secretary is, as I say, to be the face and voice of this country on the world stage, on the actions of our government and on behalf of our people. As I say, I've met Richard. I've spoken with him about the BBC World Service, which, of course, is a part of the BBC which is of most directly relevant to my department and the functions of my department. I didn't have, there's no reason why I would have conversations with either him or the Prime Minister about this particular thing, because, as I say, anyone that looks at his CV can see he has a wealth of experience with large organisations. And of course, the fact of the matter is there are plenty of people, as I say, who are or have been senior within the BBC who have a political link. So there's nothing wrong with that. The appointment clearly is one that requires someone of huge experience. Richard has that experience, and therefore, if he says that there's no conflict of interest, I know it's quite tempting to say, well, hang on a second, he's been a donor.
That's not what I'm saying. I want to be really clear. That is absolutely not what I'm saying here. I'm talking about the specific allegation that he helped to guarantee an £800,000 loan to the Prime Minister, who weeks later recommended him for the job. If that is true, what does that say about the character and integrity of Boris Johnson?
Well, look, as I say, I don't know the details of that. You're putting these things forward. I've not had the chance to validate that. I'm not calling into question, of course, the integrity of any of the people involved in that reporting. I just don't know the detail of that. What I do know is that Richard steps into that job with a huge repository of wealth and experience. This was an appointment made by my predecessor. The Prime Minister's predecessor, but one. But Richard does have a huge wealth of experience, and as I say, it is not unusual for senior appointments into the BBC to go to people who have links with political parties.
OK. Well, this story broke yesterday in the Sunday Times. Let's talk about a story that broke a week ago in the Sun on Sunday, so hopefully you might have a bit more information on this for us. The party chairman, Nadhim Zahawi, still, of course, in Cabinet. We know that he made a settlement with HMRC over his tax affairs. How much was that settlement for?
Well, the only information I know about this is the information that he's put out in his statement. Now, Nadhim was a very, very successful entrepreneur. He, as he said in his statement, had an outstanding settlement with the HMRC, which is now settled. I don't have any more details than he has put in his public statement.
OK, so we don't know how much the settlement was for with HMRC. Did he pay a penalty?
Well, again, I don't know any more than is in his statement. And the HMRC, the words that they used was this was an error, this was careless rather than
That's
intentional.
not the words HMRC used, that's the words that Nadhim Zahawi uses in his statement.
Well, my understanding is that that reflects the position that HMRC took towards this situation.
So you say that all you know is what's in Nadhim Zahawi's statement that was made yesterday. There are two pretty critical bits of information that weren't in the statement. A, how much the settlement was for, and B, whether he paid a penalty or not. Do you not think that Nadeem Zahawi needs to come out and give us these facts, these very simple facts?
Well, look, I mean, we know that Nadeem was a very successful businessman before he came into politics, incredibly successful minister, particularly in his role as vaccines minister. But ultimately, people's taxpayers in this country, people's taxpayers are private matters, and I know that as politicians, we quite rightly are expected to have a higher level of disclosure than perhaps other people might do. Nadeem has issued a statement where he has admitted that he made a careless error, that this is now resolved with the RC. And I'm speculating about other people's personal finances. Even though I totally understand the fact that we are expected to be, I think, more open than other people in society would be, and he has been more open than others would be. And he's made the point.
He hasn't been.
He's made the point.
He hasn't put this information in the public domain. It was on Sunday he put this information in the public domain, and since then, I'll be honest, I'm not clear, how much the settlement was for, whether he paid a penalty. I'm not sure he has been clear if we haven't been told the simple information. And also, to be honest, I'm really not sure it's good enough either. There'll be millions of people who will be witnessing this story, people watching this morning as well, who, are struggling to make ends meet. They still pay their taxes on time. They pay the correct amount of tax. Don't they have a right to know whether a member of the government made a settlement with HMRC, how much it was for, and if he was paid a penalty?
Well, I think what people have seen is that Nadeem had been a very successul entrepreneur and business person before.
But that's not the question. We're not asking about his success outside. We're asking about his tax affairs, and it's still just really not clear.
No, I think it is relevant because it's worth remembering that whatever tax he was required to pay was a direct byproduct of the fact that he created a business, a successful business, which employed people, and that business would have paid tax. Those individuals would have paid taxes. Nadeem has paid taxes, been a huge contributor to the UK economy, as well as being a very, very effective minister, particularly in that incredibly difficult time where he used his business experience in the management of the vaccine rollout. He has said that an error was made, but that is now fully resolved. And as I say, the fact that this is in the public domain is something that you wouldn't normally expect, other people necessarily to go through. But I totally recognise as politicians, we do quite legitimately have an increased interest and focus and an increased expectation of transparency. But as I say, Nadeem has said that this money has been, his relationship with the HMRC has been settled in full, and I don't know any more details beyond what was in his statement.
He says that he made an error. He says that he was careless. I mean, you're careless if you miss a self-assessment deadline by a week. You're careless if you spill the milk when you're making a cup of tea. You're not careless if, reportedly, you end up paying £1 million penalty to HMRC, are you?
Well, there's process and there's magnitude. I mean, you say that people do make errors, and when those errors are highlighted, some people try to avoid making it right or doing the right thing, and others do the right thing. Nadeem's done the right thing.
In his statement, Nadeem Zahawi says, "When I was being appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, questions were being raised about my tax affairs. I discussed this with the Cabinet Office at the time." When Nadeem Zahawi was Chancellor, was he under investigation by HMRC?
Well, as I say, I don't know any more detail about the timing, about the granularity of this beyond what's in his statement. But the point is,
this is not granularity. This is the question about whether the Chancellor, the man who is literally in charge of tax, was under investigation by HMRC over his taxes. And you don't know if that's true or not. I mean, that you can see how that looks, right?
Well, as I say, the detail I have is the detail that Nadeem has put out in his public statement. And the point I've made is that this tax was due because he was a successful entrepreneur who grew a business from nothing. He came to this country with nothing, as you know, his backstory, escaping violence, persecution, and possible death in Iraq, coming to this country with nothing, unable to speak English, and he built a very, very successful company, employing people, and that is why these taxes were due, and ultimately he, in conversation with HMRC, came to the arrangement whereby those taxes were fully paid. And I think that is, and as I say, I can't guess and I won't speculate about more detail than that. But the point is, he has said that it was an error, and he is now fully up to date with the HMRC.
He says that he discussed it with the Cabinet Office when he was made Chancellor. When was Rishi Sunak aware of questions, shall we say, concerns over Nadeem Zahawi's tax affairs?
You know the answer to that question already, because I've already said I don't know any more detail than is in his public statement. So if you're asking me for more detail than in his public statement, I'm not able to give you that detail. And I know that might be frustrating, but as I say, I don't know any more about the.
That's very convenient, isn't it? It's very convenient. I mean, I'll be honest. I just, most people would expect if you're coming out to be the front of the government this morning to be aware if the guy, when he was Chancellor, was under investigation by HMRC, when the Prime Minister knew about these allegations. You would expect to have done that research, no?
Look, my job is as Foreign Secretary. As I say, what I've done this week is work on behalf of the government. This is not. I'm not an investigator. I'm not an investigative journalist, and I'm not. And I'm not. It's not my function or role to investigate my colleagues' tax affairs. My desire to come on the show this morning was because I wanted to talk about the world that the work that the UK is doing on the world stage, the position that we're taking with regard to the defence of Ukraine.
We'll talk about Ukraine. We'll talk about Ukraine. One final question on Nadeem Zahawi. Will he survive? Will he survive until Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday?
I knew inevitably that I would have to speak about other issues as well, but there is a wide range of things that I'm dealing with just in my portfolio.
Yeah,
and as I say,
I will literally talk about Ukraine after you answer this question. Will Nadeem Zahawi survive until Prime Minister's questions?
Well, I mean, look, that's the kind of question that's designed to get a nice little clip, because it's. I mean, what answer I'm going to say other than yes? Because he is a very, very effective minister. He has shown himself to be, very, very successful businessman before coming into politics, taking that business experience into his role as vaccines minister. It is clear why he has been appointed to senior positions within the government, because he has demonstrated effectiveness in both the private sector and the public sector throughout his career.
OK, well, let's talk about Ukraine, shall we? The story that I would have started this interview on if it hadn't been for the two allegations about members of the Cabinet. Now, the UK has pledged to send Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. Should Germany send tanks as well?
Well, we want to make sure that the Ukrainians prevail. We want to make sure that that is done quickly, because that is the best way of saving as many lives as possible. The United Kingdom has been very much at the forefront of supporting Ukraine with military equipment since before the invasion started, and we continue to do so with the announcement of those Challenger 2 tanks, as well as a whole range of other military donations. Of course, we continue to liaise with our international partners. We would like to see everybody going as far as they can, but each country will support Ukraine in the way that is most appropriate to them. Of course, I have been talking on the international stage about the provision of armoured vehicles, including tanks, to Ukraine, because that is what they're telling us that they need to defeat Russia in the east and south of their country.
I mean, that's what they're saying to Germany as well, isn't it? And it's significant because, you know, the German Leopard 2 tanks are seen as a potential game changer for Ukraine because they're easy to maintain. They're designed specifically to be effective against Russian tanks. Last week on the programme, I spoke to Ukrainian MP Nazir Afzal, who basically said Germany isn't doing enough. Do you think she's right?
Well, look, Germany has done a huge amount already, and it's worth remembering that they come from a very different starting point in terms of their defence posture compared to compared to and I have been talking with my international counterparts about the provision of military equipment, particularly the Leopard 2 tank, which is an incredibly effective piece of equipment. Of course, I would like to see the Ukrainians equipped with things like the Leopard 2, as well as the artillery systems that have been provided by us and by others. I will keep having those conversations with our NATO allies and friends to facilitate the donation of the best military equipment to Ukraine to help them defend themselves against this brutal invasion.
Now, the war in Ukraine is having a huge impact on, well, every country in the world, but in particularly some of the poorest nations when it comes to the rising price of food in particular. I spoke to the president of the World Bank this week. We'll hear the interview a little bit later on the programme, who was concerned about the level of debt that some of these poorest nations have. And he said that the wealthier countries should think about writing off some of that debt. Do you think he's got a point?
Well, look, the desire for debt write-off is something that is discussed regularly. It's one of those things that is as compelling as a headline, but there are some practical challenges with regards to the provision of future debt. If there is a belief that debt will be written off, particularly when public sector money is leveraging in the private sector. But the simple truth is that the global south, the poorer countries in the world, are suffering directly because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The UK, we very much supported the Ukrainian grain initiative, which saw Ukrainian grain exports coming out of the Black Sea directly to some of the poorest countries in the world. Indeed, I was in northern Ethiopia, which is suffering its 5th years of failed rain, to see Ukrainian grains distributed by World Food Programme trucks, which had been supplied using UK aid and development money. So we will continue to support the provision of food to the global south, who are suffering because of Russia's, as a brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine.
OK, we are out of time. It's been a tough morning round, but you are the one from the government fronting up, answering questions on this. So we do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much.
James Cleverly there for the government. Well, let's get Labour's take on all of that now, shall we? We're joined by the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden. Thank you very much for being on the programme today. I know you were across the James Cleverly interview. What was your reaction to it?
Well, look, I wish we were talking about other things. We've
had might do as well.
Things to say yesterday about the cost of living crisis and energy bills and so on. I think the problem with these things, if you take these different stories together, is that it's very easy for the public to conclude they're all the same, they're all in it for themselves. And I think with the Boris Johnson stuff, he almost relies on that level of cynicism so that people conclude no scandal matters, nothing matters, because that's what they're like anyway. And I feel more than the individual cases, this is really corrosive to governance and government. There are big problems facing the country. We need good government. And I think it'd be a tragedy if the result of all this was for people to just simply turn away from politics and say they're all a bunch of crooks and knaves.
Now, important to say Boris Johnson's spokesperson says the story is rubbish, that Richard Sharp didn't give him any financial advice, there hasn't been any remuneration for Richard Sharp. You've reported Boris Johnson to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. Why have you done that?
We've done that because we think this needs to be looked into. Boris Johnson's spokesperson said, so what, big deal, which actually sums up his whole response to all of these things over the last couple of years. On the specifics of this, the allegation is that the chairman of the BBC acted as a broker to help facilitate a loan of £800,000 to Boris Johnson while he was a candidate to become the chairman of the BBC. That's not just Labour that said this. We understand the Cabinet Office actually intervened to say that this arrangement couldn't continue because he was a candidate to become chairman of the BBC. So obviously that begs big questions about what was going on here, and that's why we've made that reference.
Now, Richard Sharp says that there wasn't a conflict of interest. We heard James Cleverly there saying that Richard Sharp is a man of great integrity, that he understands why he was given the role. Is the BBC impartial?
Well, look, I'm not here to have a pop at the BBC, but I do think it's pretty extraordinary if someone who was running to be the chairman ends up acting as a broker to help the Prime Minister of the day out of whatever financial difficulties he was in. At the very least, that should all have been declared and brought into the open. There's nothing in Boris Johnson's declaration of interest as an MP about this. It's been brought into the open by journalism, not by people being transparent. And that's why I do think this does need to be looked into. OK,
as you say, you're calling for the investigation. They say that the story isn't accurate, so we'll see how that goes. Let's talk about Nadhim Zahawi, shall we? James Cleverly says that he will survive till Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. What's your take?
I think it's difficult for Mr Zahawi because the problem with this is what we're being asked to believe. And we're being asked to believe that he had this asset worth £27 million that he didn't really know was his and therefore didn't really know tax was due on it. And the thing about his statement issued yesterday is he was using pretty heavy legal letters to try to get people to be quiet about this back in July, to Dan Needle, the tax expert who exposed some of this, to newspapers like The Independent, threatening legal action. And then we're asked to believe that it's all just carelessness. That doesn't quite fit. So I think this is quite difficult for him now.
Rishi Sunak, is there a question mark about what he knew? James Cleverly said, look, I don't know anything about this. All I know is what is in Nadhim Zahawi's statement. But he's obviously, cabinet minister. He's a party chairman under Rishi Sunak. Is it a problem for the Prime Minister too?
Well, I think it is, because when he came into office, he promised a new broom on all this, that after the Boris Johnson days, when propriety and ethics had been in the news almost every day through one scandal or another, that he would, turn over a new leaf, there'd be a new page and so on. So I think this is a test of that. And if you've got someone who was negotiating all this while he was the Chancellor, threatening people with legal action, and then coming to the conclusion that he's owed millions of pounds to the tax man, and probably with a penalty in it as well. We don't know for sure, but it looks that way. I think this is a question for the Prime Minister as well, because what does that new broom, that turning the page on the propriety and ethics questions mean if this is just shrugged off?
And we should say, of course, Nadhim Zahawi's statement point towards his statement yesterday, where he says that his taxes are, now up to date, that he reached the settlement with HMRC to do that. Do you think that actually we're getting to a stage now where high-profile politicians should actually just publish their tax returns? Maybe
they should. I've got no problem with that. What concerns me more about this is what I said at the beginning, that the public will just conclude everybody's at it in some way. Well, that's the way to counter that, though, right?
Well, transparency, to shine a light on it.
It may be on tax, as I say. I would have no problem with that. But these scandals are not just about tax returns. With Boris Johnson question that we're discussing today is about something else. What I'm more concerned with is that people give up on politics, and that would be really bad for the country, because there are plenty of serious issues that need good governance and need politics to address them. The cost of living crisis is one. The situation in the NHS is another. There is plenty to be doing here, and I don't want people to think politics can't have any solutions because they're all in it for themselves.
Well, let's talk about some of those serious issues now, shall we? And the NHS you mentioned, we of course seen the strike action from nurses and ambulance workers too. We'll be talking to Unite Sharon Graham shortly. Nurses have signalled that they would accept a pay rise of around 10%. Would Labour grant that?
I've been doing interviews on this for 3 months, and every time a journalist has asked me what's the percentage, I've had to point out this has got to be negotiated between the employers, the government and the union. I'm not going to give a percentage today. The important thing is that staff in these sectors get a decent pay rise.
What is a decent pay rise then?
Because these strikes...
Genuinely, what do you think is a decent pay rise then?
You know, it has to be negotiated. I'm not going to give a figure.
But you just said that staff need to be given a decent pay. Literally, what is a decent pay rise?
Well, that's got to be negotiated.
Is that matching inflation?
That's got to be negotiated around the table.
I mean, that's obviously it has to be negotiated.
Yes.
That's clearly a fact. But I just wonder, you know, if you say that journalists have been asking you this question for 3 months, do you think that's because we're not getting an answer? We don't know what Labour will give. Is a fair pay rise 2%? Is a fair pay rise 12%?
I can name any percent you want today.
Yeah, that'd be great,
10,
actually. Thank you.
20, 50. And the fact is, because we're in opposition, it doesn't get the nurses an extra penny.
Well, it might do a lot to help them if Labour came out with a policy.
Labour coming out with a percentage doesn't make any difference to these strikes. What would make a difference in the longer term is a government that really backed public services. And that's what we did when we were in government. We didn't have these strikes. We managed to give people both decent pay rises and fund the public services properly. And that's what we'll do if we get elected, because the problem for the NHS...
If you fund the public services properly, then would you be prepared to give more money to the NHS?
The problem for the NHS is not just the current industrial dispute. The problem for the NHS is that even when there isn't a strike day, we've got 7 million people on waiting lists. So what we've said is staffing is at the heart of this. We need to train more doctors. We need to train more nurses. We need to change the way the system works. Our ambition isn't just to save this service, it's to renew it for the future. We've said how we'll do that. We've said how we'll fund that. There's got to be a longer-term solution to public services other than just a short-term ambition to get through the strikes.
Sure, but I guess what the nurses' unions would say is that it's not just a short-term ambition. This is all about the workforce, right? And if people feel that they're not getting paid a fair amount, then they're going to leave, which is what's happening right now. They've got a recruitment crisis. And I have to say, you know, Labour say, look, you know, we get around the table and negotiate, we would give a fair deal to nurses. But if you look at the actual meat of what you're saying, I can't work out how it's different from the government, because you won't put a figure on what you do.
A figure from opposition would be pretty meaningless because we're not a party to the negotiations. When we were in government, we managed to negotiate decent pay rises for NHS staff and fund the service properly. You know, these days they're talking about an ambition of getting a GP appointment in 2 weeks. When we were in office, it was within 48 hours. That's the difference that can be made. But I've got to also be honest with your viewers. After 13 years, the situation that we inherit won't be turned around overnight. It will take time to rebuild the NHS. And that's why we've put this issue of staffing and training more doctors and nurses at the heart of our proposals, because there is no solution to the long-term problems of the NHS without addressing staffing. Pay is an issue. Of course, it's an issue with inflation running at the levels it is today. But it's not just about pay. It's about short staffing on wards. It's about waiting lists with just not enough people in the service to deal with them. So we need to deal with that and renew the NHS so that it can really be the 21st century health service that we need.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Pat McFadden there for the Labour Party. Now, you're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Busy show today. Lots of interviews so far, not least, of course, with James Cleverly, who said he wasn't going to get into the granular detail of Nadine Zahawi's tax affairs. Plus, Pat McFadden there talking about Labour's response. Now, in just a moment, we're going to be talking to the General Secretary of the Unite Union, Sharon Graham, and a little later on the programme, we're also going to be hearing from the President of the World Bank, David Malpass. So that's an interesting one too. Plus, we'll get a bit of reaction from our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who's been watching all of our interviews. We are going to be speaking to Sam a little bit later as well. Well, despite the scandals that we've been talking about today, the main challenge facing the Prime Minister and the country, of course, or one of the main challenges is the strikes crisis. Ambulance staff and nurses will be walking out again in the coming days and weeks as the NHS faces what many view as its most difficult winter in living memory. And there's no deal in sight, of course, for teachers or potentially on the railways too. Well, we're joined now by the General Secretary of the Unite Union, Sharon Graham. Thanks very much for being with us. We spent an awful lot of time on the programme today talking about Nadhim Zahawi's tax affairs or loans taken out by Boris Johnson. Are you worried that this is effectively a distraction for the government?
Totally, because it's woeful listening to this, because, of course, the big issue now is the NHS and what is going to happen in relation to the NHS. And I've heard government ministers coming on different programmes, your programmes, other programmes, literally saying that they are in talks with unions. And there has been no talks with unions. So we're still in exactly the same position that we've been in for weeks. There's another strike tomorrow. There's an escalation of strikes over the coming weeks. And Rishi Sunak, I have to say, is missing in action. I don't know where he is. He should be getting round the table. He is the CEO of this company, if you were talking about negotiating terms. He is the key decision maker. It's clear Stephen Barclay cannot make a decision. Now, it's either that Rishi Sunak is not up to this job, that he doesn't want to come into the negotiating room and to do this deal, or there must be another reason as to why he's allowing this self-harm to happen to the NHS.
There have been some talks, though, right? Stephen Barclay has been talking to some union members, right?
But they're not pay talks. And this is the problem. The big issue here is about pay. There is an issue where the ambulance workers, the nurses, the NHS are saying we need a pay rise. The public is supporting that pay rise, as we can see from surveys. And we've got the employer, in this instance, the government, who will talk about anything, but they won't talk about pay.
Next year's pay rise, right?
But
that's not the one that's gone.
Well, that's not what the dispute is about. The dispute is about 22-23. But they haven't made any offer, Sophie. This is the scenario. I mean, I negotiate every day of my life. I'm in the rooms with CEOs all the time. We know what it does and what has to happen to have deals happen. This employer, being the government, is not interested in doing a deal as far as the NHS is concerned. And I have to say, we are concluding now that there must be a much more sinister reason for this, because this level of self-harm is unprecedented. The public are crying out. I came here in a cab this morning and the cab driver was saying, why don't they just give a pay rise to the NHS? Everybody wants that to happen. It's almost like there is another reason for them doing what they're doing, because it's total incompetence otherwise.
What do you think that reason is then?
Well, I think that they are looking to privatise the NHS. Genuinely, I believe that they're looking as this is the moment they can privatise the NHS. I said when I was on your programme the last time that I was very concerned about the Chancellor, who was the health secretary, who wanted the NHS in the American trade deal. And there was a big fight about making sure it wasn't in the American trade deal. There is something unusual going on here, that they will not come to the table. There are choices that can be made that means we can pay for this. There is not a problem about paying with the fifth richest country in the world. There is something going on here. Otherwise, they are at a level of incompetence not known, because it's unreal.
It's a big claim to say the government is looking to privatise the NHS, and that goes against everything that they've said about the NHS remaining free at the point of use. I mean, Labour are prepared to countenance more private sector involvement in the NHS right now than the government. You know, do you have any evidence to back this up? Because I guess what they would say is, look, at the minute, we're spending more on debt interest than education. This is why there has to be pay restraint.
Well, actions speak louder than words to me. So words, words are cheap. There is a crisis in the NHS. They can come to the table and negotiate on this crisis. All the General Secretaries, including me, have said we will be there anytime, any place, anywhere. We'll cancel any meeting to be there in that room. He is the CEO of this group of workers, and he refuses to come to the table. Now, it's either that he doesn't know what to do when he gets to that table. I mean, maybe he doesn't know how to negotiate. I don't know. Maybe it's that there is another issue going on. But we have to look at what's happening. Why would they not be coming to the table and deal with this issue? Everyone is crying out for them to get this issue solved. And unless they solve the issue of workers and the crisis of workers in NHS and those people leaving the NHS, we will never be able to get the NHS back on its knees. And they know that.
How long could these strikes go on for?
Well, I hope that they are resolved very, very quickly. But the problem is, and, when you're in a negotiation, two parties have to speak and they have to come out with a deal, and then that deal will go back to the membership. We have not had any deal to take back to the membership. They went round different studios before Christmas saying they were going to offer things. It was nearly there, glimmers of hope. I didn't have warm, fuzzy feeling of hope, I have to tell you, because I've seen this many times before. They haven't even offered a deal. So they're being disingenuous by pretending that there are talks going on about pay, significantly about pay. There are absolutely no talks going on about pay. Every General Secretary will tell you that.
Do you think part of the issue is that initially some of the proposals were what the government would describe as clearly unaffordable, 90% for nurses, for example?
Well, that tells me they don't understand negotiation. Obviously, there is an opening situation where a claim is tabled. I think it's really clear that what we're talking about is a pay rise in the double-digit pay rise. That's what we're talking about. The RCN have already said they'd meet them halfway. I don't know how much more hints do they want to take on that. So it's a double-digit pay rise. If they came in the room and they offered a double-digit pay rise, we would take that back to our members and our members would make the decision. But they're not doing that. They are playing with words, dancing around their handbags, and they're not coming and doing the deal they need to do to get the NHS back working.
Now, we're having rolling strikes in the NHS, nurses, ambulance workers, at a time when we all know the NHS is under a lot of pressure, right? Do you accept that that is putting people's lives at risk?
Well, what I'd say about that is that their lives are at risk already. 500 people a week. I mean, just think of that number, because we say numbers very quickly. 500 people a week are dying waiting for ambulances. 500 a week. That is unbelievable in a country like ours. People are dying. If we don't take this stand and we don't sort out what's going on in the NHS, it will crash and die. And so, therefore, this strike, yes, it's about pay. Absolutely, 100% it's about pay. And I think people want the NHS to get a pay rise. But it's also about the NHS itself. And it's on its knees. Unless we can get more people working in it, it will not survive. So it's a strike to save the NHS as well as get a good pay rise for workers.
The strike obviously has an impact too. That's certainly the view of Amanda Pritchard, the Chief Executive of NHS England, who said in an interview this week, as the strike action is extended over long periods of time, and as those dates start coming closer together, it does get more challenging. There is absolutely no doubt it is clearly having an impact. I think that's obvious.
Yes, absolutely. And, of course, what we do in strikes, and, you know, this is what we do across the board in the NHS, is that we put safety guarantees in. So I was on the picket line in the West Midlands for the ambulance dispute. I'm on the picket line tomorrow in the North West for the ambulance dispute. And we negotiate safety cover in relation to those disputes.
But it's never going to be as good, is it? You admit that, right? If we're talking about 500 people a week, as you say, according to the, acute medicine people, they say that's 500 people a week, up to 500 people dying because of delays for ambulances. If ambulance workers go on strike, that's going to have an impact.
But we are putting in safety levels that mean it doesn't have as much as an impact. And that is actually the irony here. We could be in a situation, which we were on the 21st, where it was safer on the 21st than it was in normal play, because we are in minimum service levels anyway. There's 130,000 people missing from the NHS. And to be honest with you, Sophie, what has to happen here is quite a simple solution. The government, all they need to do is to come to the table, do a negotiation, we come out of the room, we put it to the members, they ballot, and then everyone's back to work. It's a very simple thing. This has been drawn out for weeks and weeks and weeks. And you have to think, is this deliberate? Is it deliberate that they're drawing this out?
Are you saying that ministers are effectively lying then? When they say that they are?
Yes, I am saying that. The ministers have been lying on a number of issues, and normally I wouldn't use that word. It's not really a word that we would use. We tend to dance around that word a lot. But I have to tell you, the stuff that's been said about ambulance workers and them not covering minimum safety levels on disputes was a lie. And I'll say it very clearly, it was a lie. The stuff that's been trotted out, I did something last week and the government's response was we're in talks. That is a lie. They are absolutely not in pay talks. And this is the problem, that we haven't got an honest partner at the other side of the table. Normally you go into a negotiation, yes, you have argy-bargy, you don't always agree, you don't get everything you want, that is life. But you know that the person on the other side of the table wants resolution. I'm negotiating with somebody at the moment that I don't think wants resolution, and that's a real problem.
Well, I have to say, listening, whatever the truth, listening to you now, it does feel like that deal is an awful long way off. Just before I spoke to you, we spoke to Pat McFadden of Labour. I was trying to get a sense about what Labour would do if they were in government right now, what pay rise they would see as fair. He said that, he's not going to give a number, that would be meaningless, it wouldn't make any difference. Is he right, or do you think it would be helpful if Labour actually were a bit clearer on what they would do?
Well, look, Labour aren't in government, so he's right about that. But obviously they're in opposition. So I have to say, you know, I would prefer Labour to be in government. I think they would be far better on the NHS and a number of things. But actually, this is a moment to come out, in my opinion. I think they should come out to say that they would give the NHS a pay rise and it would be 10%. I think that just needs to be said, because everybody knows what we're talking about. We're all pretending we don't know the figure. I think they need to do that, because what that will do then is they'll be in step with the public, I have to tell you, but also it would say to the government the opposition is asking for the same thing. If they were in your seat, they would do the same thing. And it's really important, because this is important because people keep using it as a reason. It can be afforded. There are ways to do it. There are choices to be made that means this can be afforded.
Why do you think Labour aren't coming out and saying that?
Well, they'll have to answer that. I mean, you know, for me, I think what people are looking for is leadership. You know, whenever I go into a negotiation, whenever I'm in a room, what you want people to be is clear. This is what I will do. This is what we want. This is what we need.
And you think Labour isn't showing leadership on this?
Well, I think that they are trying to be too cautious about it. You know, and that's, you know, when you're in a situation, we're in crisis now. This is not the time for being cautious. This is the time to show real leadership. And in opposition, you can show leadership. So I'd like them to come out and say, yes, they support the pay rise, and yes, it would be a pay rise in the region of 10%. I don't see any problem with them doing that.
OK, you've been very clear on the programme this morning, I have to say, 10%. Thank you very much indeed, Sharon Graham.
Thank you very much.
Of Unite. Well, as usual, The Take is going to follow this programme just after 9:30. It's our chance to analyse today's interviews, talk through any news lines. I think there have been a few, I have to say, so far on the programme. And we can get a quick take now from Sam on what stood out for him. Sam, it's been one of those mornings, hasn't it, where there is an awful lot of news around. What did you make of the interview so far? What stood out?
What stood out to me is that, well, listening to James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, it's hear no evil, see no evil morning there. He said, I'm not an investigator, I don't know what's going on. Boris Johnson has come out and said that he rubbishes, effectively, suggestions that the now chairman of the BBC helped broker an £800,000 credit facility for him a couple of years back. Nadhim Zahawi has come out and said that it was an innocent mistake that meant that he had to settle with HMRC, possibly for millions of pounds, possibly also paying for a penalty to HMRC as well. But critically, Sophie, James Cleverly came out and backed Nadhim Zahawi to stay in his job as Tory party chairman and Richard Sharp to stay in his job as BBC chairman. And this is the thing, right, Sophie? Rishi Sunak's administration was meant to be different. He promised integrity in Number 10. And as however much Number 10 now might want these to be historical issues, both in some ways linked to the Boris Johnson regime, you've nevertheless got Nadhim Zahawi in a prominent job in the Conservative Party right now. And Richard Sharp, of course, was Rishi Sunak's old boss at Goldman Sachs, and the two are very, very close. So all of this stuff still comes back to Rishi Sunak, so it's still up to the Prime Minister to show that the administration he lives up to that promise he made on the first day on the steps of Downing Street.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. We'll have much more from you at 9:30, in just about 10 minutes or so, when we'll be chatting to Sam in a bit more depth about some of the interviews on the programme today. Wow, I'll take a moment. It feels like it's been quite a busy show so far, I have to say. So a bit of a change of pace now, because it's almost a year since Russia reinvaded Ukraine, and the war is grinding on through a brutally cold winter in the region, and the level of human suffering there is really difficult to comprehend. But of course, it's had impacts across the world, not least soaring food and energy prices that hit the poorest hardest. Now, a little earlier, I spoke to the president of the World Bank, David Malpass. I'm going to start with quite a stupid question, if I may. You are president of the World Bank. Can you just explain to our viewers, what is the World Bank? What does it do?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Sophie. The World Bank takes in money from donors in two ways. One is we sell shares, and we also take annual contributions, and then we provide that to developing countries. So the goal is to get better outcome for people in developing countries. We recognize that's part of being good citizens in the world, but also it supports everyone if you can get faster growth in the poorer countries. That's been the big challenge. It's not happening right now, and that's a grave concern.
It's interesting you say that it's not happening right now. Why do you think that is?
the poorer countries are facing this giant challenge that the advanced economies use a lot of the world's resources, and now you've got these sudden obstacles. COVID was one, obviously. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is adding to food costs and to fertilizer costs, and the countries are cut off from world markets. So you get this combination of forces that causes them to fall into recession, but it's worse than that. It's really the reversal in development. Poverty is getting worse. Education levels are going down in many of the developing countries. So it's incumbent, I think, on the world to do a lot more. The World Bank has been really expanding our efforts across the developing world.
You talk about the war in Ukraine. You also mentioned the impact of COVID as well. What's happening when it comes to debt with developing countries?
The debt is a huge challenge. Part of the debt is in the advanced economies. You know, many of them have record debt to GDP levels, and that soaks up a big portion of the world's capital, which means it's not available for small businesses and for developing countries. That's a misallocation of capital, and I think it should be really directly looked at by the advanced economies to make their spending more efficient. And then as you look at the developing countries, some of them overused the low interest rate environment to borrow over the last decade. So the debt went up, way up. We're at record levels, and that's coming at a time when their growth rates and their new investment rates have gone way down.
You know, I remember, I think it was back at the G8 in 2005, there was a big focus on debt reduction, on forgiveness, on writing off debt. You're obviously now worried, as many are, that poorer countries are overloaded with debt again. Do you think some of that should be written off?
Yes, I think there needs to be a hard look at large amounts of debt reduction by the official bilateral creditors and also the private sector creditors. The composition of debt has changed over that period that you name, over the last 10 years, heavily toward debt from China and also debt from the private sector.
It's interesting you mentioned the high levels of loans from China. Should we be concerned about China's influence in the developing world?
China is the world's second biggest economy, so I think we should expect their influence in the developing world. They do it both by selling things into the developing world, but also by buying raw materials and by offering debt. So what we have strongly advocated, and I was in China late in 2022, we've advocated transparency in their debt contracts. In that way, people can restructure them or can at least understand what the commitments are that are being made by the poorer countries. That transparency means don't include non-disclosure clauses in a contract, making it a secret contract. That seems to still be going on even today.
There's been a few things in the interview so far that you've called for to happen. If you could, wave your magic wand and have one piece of policy across the world to make things better, what would you choose?
So much of the money is taken up by the advanced economies. I think there's a big burden to be as efficient as possible in government spending. That would be a signal, a forward signal to the markets that there was going to be capital available for others, and that would allow the investment flows to become more balanced. That would provide money in the poor countries for education and for health and for climate adaptation, which is so desperately needed, and for food, as we were discussing before. But right now, there's just not an availability of capital. At the World Bank, where we have a major effort underway with our shareholders to look for more resources and to use the resources as effectively as possible to meet the needs of people in poor countries.
And just finally, we're kind of edging towards the end of January now. What are your predictions for 2023? Do you think things are going to ease up when it comes to the world economy, or do we have tough times ahead?
I think it's a long-lasting slowdown. It's not exactly a cycle the way we've been used to in the past. And that has to do with the persistence of inflation, the shortage of new investment that's taking place right now. So as you look 1 year ahead and 2 years ahead, it's hard to see that there'll be a strong recovery. That puts burden on the on policymakers to make decisions now to have the spending be more efficient. That applies both to the private sector and to the governments to make their spending really count, so that there can be a recovery going out into the future. My concern is it looks like the slowdown or this period of slow growth for the world may last into 2023, 24, and that's a concern. One other thing I'll mention is when governments do subsidize their citizens, which is politically necessary and attractive, they need to have it be time-bound and targeted. In other words, rather than giving benefits to everyone for the foreseeable future, do it for 6 months for the narrowest group that is possible, that is hurt by the higher prices that are occurring now.
When you say things like efficiency in spending and subsidising citizens, am I right in thinking what you mean by that is tightening belts, it's spending less, it's, I guess, austerity slightly?
Yes, exactly. And that means making choices, hard choices. And this applies to the developing world and even the poorest countries. There's inefficient spending. And so we work with the countries to improve that. One example is on taxes, where the countries aren't collecting taxes maybe from a select group of people that get exemptions from taxes. That's not fair to everyone else. And it doesn't get the country through this long period of slowdown. So belt tightening, if you want to use that phrase, yes.
Thank you very much. It's been really interesting to talk. Thank you. Now, it was another dark week for the Met. A serving officer admitted dozens of sexual offences and rapes, and there were reports that several hundred more are under investigation right now. And that, of course, has led to yet more questions about the culture and the future of the UK's biggest and most important police force. Well, Nazir Afzal led a year-long investigation into the culture of the London Fire Brigade. He's a former Chief Crown Prosecutor. He joins us now live from Manchester. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. I've been really looking forward to speaking to you. You obviously have a reputation of, investigating these institutions without fear or favour. What was your reaction to the stories that we've seen coming out of the Met Police? David Carrick, serving officer, convicted of 71 sex offences.
We have a police emergency, Sophie, which is not being addressed at all with the urgency it requires. I mean, I recall, I'm old enough to remember when the Yorkshire Ripper campaign of terror was taking place and police told women that they shouldn't go out alone. Now women are telling police officers, male police officers, that they shouldn't go out alone. And we've got a situation, quite frankly, where this problem has just grown and grown without the level of response it requires. I mean, I've worked with thousands of excellent police officers who will be as horrified as the rest of us by what we are learning, and morale must be really low. But at the same time, any short-sighted, knee-jerk response will not solve the deeply rooted misogyny that we have here. And I can't understand how the Home Secretary can just point to the police without referencing the toxic, sexist, misogynistic culture that we have in society. Last year, if you remember, she resisted our attempt to make misogyny a hate crime. So, but it's not just about misogyny. We've also had racism. It's not just London either. We've had it in Gwent and other places. It's everything, everywhere, all at once. And I've come across in my time several officers who were racist, sexist, homophobic. I always reported them. And there are, I'm afraid, Sophie, hundreds of bigots with warrant cards. And there are a few things worse than people who have power and can use that power, which we don't have, to, in effect, maintain their prejudice and use their prejudice against other people. I don't see the response that we require. People, I think the Home Office, in particular the Home Secretary, doesn't get the fact that women are now scared. Women, who can you go to? I mean, the policing is a state-run monopoly. There's nowhere else to go to. And right now, people are really fearful about who they may speak to, given the experiences of Sarah Everard and the victims of David Carrick.
It's, hearing you speak, it's hard to disagree with what you say. And of course, the IOPC, the police watchdog itself, found a culture of racism and misogyny in the Met too. You say that the response hasn't been enough. What the government say is that, look, they're going to bump up the vetting procedure. They're going to make it easier to get rid of bad apples, if you like, in the police. What do you make of the response?
Well, see, it's not a bad apple. It's not a bad apples. It's a whole orchard, I'm afraid. They are playing with words. They're tinkering around the edges. What we have here is, you mentioned the IOPC, the Independent Office of Police Conduct. There's also the His Majesty's Inspectorate of Fire Rescue and Constabulary. And there are also, police will also have their professional standards departments. None of them are doing their job properly. People, whistleblowers, victims, do not have confidence in the institutions that currently exist, which are meant to be protecting them and meant to be investigating these matters. So, and also, HR and People Services, and I found this out with London Fire Brigade as I did with others. The HR and People Services are meant to be a referee, but what we found is they're actually a goalkeeper. They're keeping out complaints. So there now needs to be an independent hotline. There now needs to be independent investigatory body. There needs to be an independent complaints process, because at the moment, people are really concerned that people are not being held accountable. Additionally, Sophie, where is that zero tolerance? One strike. It should be one strike, no words of warning, no retraining, instant dismissal after due process. We can't have people, as we have in the force or forces, who are carrying on as they always have done and simply been given a slap on the wrist. And the senior leadership have a lot to blame here. There's not one non-white chief constable, and there has only been one ever. There is a very undiverse group of people at the top of senior management, and they will only rebuild confidence when positive action is taken. And I'll tell you this, Sophie, there are WhatsApp groups, and I've seen some of them, and Facebook groups run by current and retired police officers, which contain the most horrific stuff. That's where you start. I'd go in there, get access to all of them, find out who's responsible. Yes, absolutely, the vetting is poor, but vetting only happens at the beginning of someone's career. So we need annual vetting. We need integrity testing. I personally think the police should be hiring a bunch of actors to play victims and put them before the people they suspect and see how they respond. And we've got to get back to the situation where we have confidence in policing, when policing realizes that they only have this power because we, the communities, give them that power.
You speak very powerfully, I have to say. You tweeted earlier saying, I have a lot of respect for the Met Police UK Commissioner Mark Rowley. I'm sure he will attempt to fix the long-standing issue of bigotry in some police, but it's wrong to suggest that he's new, given that he spent several years in the past decade working in the Met Police. Have you got concerns about the leadership in the Met?
Well, not with Mark. I mean, I've known Mark, and I know he means well, and I have no doubt that he's absolutely determined to change the culture that exists. But the Metropolitan Police is bigger than Microsoft Global. It's 70,000 staff. It's a massive undertaking. But also, never forget this, Sophie, because we're often pointing at London and saying, look, it's all in London. It's happening nationwide, and we've got 120,000 police officers with thousands of them who are bigots, who are offending in many respects, who are potentially criminals. And so it's not just about the Met. Leadership across policing needs to change, needs to adapt, needs to take this seriously, needs to be properly resourced to tackle this issue. Because at the moment, women, people of colour, minorities, we just do not have confidence in policing, and we have to have confidence in policing. Otherwise, well, we have no rule of law.
Now, you obviously did a review into the Fire Brigade, and I have to say, reading that report was, I was on air when the leak came out, and I have to say it was one of the most kind of shocking things that I've seen, some of the details of what was going on in the Fire Brigade. You called for a national inquiry because you said that people have been coming to you from different organisations saying, this is happening where I work too. Just explain what you're asking for.
Well, in the immediate aftermath of the LFB review, I was contacted by, I can't begin to tell you the number of people from policing, from media, from business, from public sector, from the National Health Service, telling me that they themselves did not feel safe in their workplaces, from racists, from misogynists, from homophobes and the like. And we can't do this piecemeal, silo by silo. It's the whole point about the whole society being toxic and people being fearful about about what's happened to them. Two women every week are murdered by their partners or ex-partners. It's a national, if not, anyway, it's a global problem. And the only way we can get to the bottom of this, I think, is a judicial inquiry, as we did post Stephen Lawrence. Stephen Lawrence, the inquiry, took us 15 years to eventually prosecute his murderers because of racism. And it was necessary for that McPherson inquiry to take place and to, in effect, bring all of this to the surface. So we need a judicial inquiry, and it has to be not just policing, it has to be across British society, because we are in a really bad place, I'm afraid to say. And there are people who are suicidal. And there were so many people who contacted me that I simply had to direct them to services that will help them. They're scared, they're frightened, they're in pain. There is an enormous amount of untreated PTSD because people are suffering in their workplaces. And I don't think we can deal with this one organization by itself. We have to look at it across society. And that's the only way we can provide safety and a place of safety for the people who work in our country.
Just finally, we've spent an awful lot of the programme talking about ministerial allegations, shall we say, whether it's Nadhim Zahawi's taxes or if it's loans given to Boris Johnson. Are you worried that this is effectively distracting the government from some of the important issues that we face in police and elsewhere?
I think, yes, it is a distraction. I'm glad that Lancashire Police went very quickly with the seatbelt allegation, but you remember Partygate took months and months and months and months before fixed penalty notices were issued, and that's policing the resources that could be used somewhere else and should be used somewhere else. The bigger issue for me is the rule of law, because any society where the powerful are able to get away with it in the minds of the public is one where the rule of law is under attack. And we've got to ensure that all of us are held to account, regardless of who we are, what role we have. And I think that, to my mind, is the bigger issue, and one that I'll keep on challenging people and holding people's feet to the fire, because it's absolutely essential that all of us have faith in our justice system.
Thank you so much. It's been really interesting to have you on the programme. I hope you'll come on in the future as well.
I will do. Thank you, Sophie.
And just before we go, a quick reminder of our weekly podcast. If you scan the QR code on the screen right now, you can find the Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast and subscribe. That will mean it's magically in your feed every week. Now, there's highlights of some of the interviews, a bit of post-match analysis and some insight as well into how we put the programme together. Now, today, we're joined by the Daily Mirror political editor, John Stevens, and, as usual, by our show editor, Scott Beasley. So find that, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Sophy Ridge on Sunday. It should be available later today. Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. In a moment after the break, we'll be running through today's interviews and seeing what we learned alongside our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning. Hi back. Hello, welcome back. I can't get my words out. I think it's been such a busy morning. It's time for The Take, where we work out a little bit what we've heard in our interviews this morning. And it's one of those days where you do feel as if the person who is doing the round for the government has pulled a bit of a short straw. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary this morning, having to answer questions about Nadhim Zahawi's tax affairs and also, of course, the story that was broken in the Sunday Times overnight about Boris Johnson and the loan of £800,000. So lots to talk about this morning. We can bring in our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, shall we? Sam, a difficult round, I think, for James Cleverly. It was one of those interviews where I was quite keen to not let him get away with the answer that they always do when there's a particularly different round. Say, look, I actually don't know. I don't know. You're the journalist, not me. And that was, I guess, my main aim, to try and point out, well, if you didn't know, why didn't you find out?
I mean, what it really reminded me of, Sophie, your interview with James Cleverly, was how ministers dealt with questions from people like you at the heart and at the height of Boris Johnson's problems. It's Groundhog Day to come on a morning round like this one, when there are clearly one or two very big issues that are going to dominate, and just say, well, I'm too busy to find out. I mean, I think he said that he was on a trip to the US and ended up doing some shopping yesterday. That's why he wasn't really able to get to the bottom of either story. And it's, I mean, if he wanted to find out, he could have done within seconds. Number 10 have access to detail about these kinds of things. There is no excuses for not getting to the bottom of it. But in a sense, Sophie, whilst you didn't get any more detail on either of these two marmalade droppers of a story, one about the role of the chairman of the BBC in brokering an £800,000 credit facility, not a loan credit facility, for Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, and then just happened to become chairman of the BBC, and then separately the question of what exactly was Nadhim Zahawi's settlement with the taxman for, and did he pay a penalty and how much? On both of those stories, you've got something far more important, which is that the government's starting position is to defend Richard Sharp and to defend Nadhim Zahawi. And this is really where it starts getting tricky for Rishi Sunak, because his whole shtick, his whole reason for being, the whole thrust of why he resigned from Boris Johnson's government, how he presents himself both during the leadership campaign last summer and how he's presented himself since he has become Prime Minister, is to draw a line between his administration and Boris Johnson's administration and make out that in some way he has integrity that Boris Johnson didn't, that he has probity and is transparent in a way that his predecessor wasn't. But when you're pelted with stories like this from every angle, and your instinct is to defend the individuals at the heart of it, and in a sense say there's nothing to see here, then politically it does all come back to the guy currently in number 10.
This government will have integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. Trust is earned and I will earn yours. Those words from Rishi Sunak when the very first speech he gave as Prime Minister. Sam, we'll talk a lot more to Sam as the programme goes on. He's right, actually. It really was reminiscent to me of some of the interviews that I did during the Boris Johnson years. Grant Shapps, in the wake of Dominic Cummings, for example, around when we were all in sort of COVID lockdown, is one that springs to mind. Let's listen to the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, shall we? He told me he hasn't consulted with either Boris Johnson or Richard Sharp following any alleged loan guarantee. And in reference to Nadhim Zahawi, he told me that people's tax affairs should be confidential, although did acknowledge that there was more of a transparency expected of ministers.
I've not had a conversation with either of those parties about that situation. I have met with Richard. We discussed the World Service. He struck me as an incredibly competent, experienced, thoughtful individual, and I can see exactly why he has the attributes, both personal and professional, to be the chair of the BBC.
There are two pretty critical bits of information that weren't in the statement. A, how much the settlement was for, and B, whether he paid a penalty or not. Do you not think that Nadhim Zahawi needs to come out and give us these facts, these very simple facts?
We know that Nadhim was a very successful businessman before he came into politics, incredibly successful minister, particularly in his role as vaccines minister. But ultimately, people's tax fares in this country, people's tax fares are private matters.
Well, let's go back to Sam, shall we? It was a painstaking defence, wasn't it, I felt, by James Cleverly. When I asked whether or not he thought that Nadeem Zahawi would survive until PMQs on Wednesday, he was like, well, that's just a bit of a question designed to have a clip. What am I supposed to say that apart from yes? So he did say yes, but it wasn't exactly the most biggest endorsement ever, was it?
It wasn't, but I mean, I think he, like probably number 10, are a bit struck. I mean, the thing that stood out to me in neon flashing lights from the section of the interview about Nadeem Zahawi that you just played was James Cleverly saying tax affairs are a private matter. Now, is James Cleverly really telling Sky viewers that they don't have the right to know whether or not the chairman of the Conservative Party is in dispute with HMRC because the taxman doesn't think Nadeem Zahawi has paid sufficient tax on his shares, possibly to the tune of millions of pounds, and whether or not effectively he had to pay backdated tax and was fined for the result? Is he really telling viewers that they have no right to know that, particularly given that Nadeem Zahawi was Chancellor at the time, so in charge of overseeing the tax saving? Is James Cleverly really telling viewers that we don't have any right to know that? But I mean, that seemed to be the implication of what he was saying. And here you get the kind of knocks are all over the system. If you look over to the other story that you were talking about Richard Sharp and the BBC, what has happened tonight, and it's nothing short of a tragedy, is that this story coming out means that, fairly or unfairly, because it's for viewers and voters to make up their own mind, this story will have galvanised 100,000 conspiracy theories about the impartiality of the BBC. And for all of our hard-working colleagues on the BBC, that's a tragedy. So these are not consequence-free events and stories. I think that there is a profound effect for what's going on, and we are just going to look at Rishi Sunak to set the piece and work out how he clears up the various messes that are quite evident this morning. Because if he is to regain the mantle of and to ensure that people trust the government, the spotlight is on him to set the tone and set the direction about both of these issues.
It's interesting how you're saying that it's a tragedy, that people will start questioning the motives of the BBC, that there are consequences to these stories. Because in some ways that was what Pat McFadden was saying too, the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, when I asked him about the Boris Johnson story and also about the Nadeem Zahawi story. He said, look, this is going to have an impact because it's going to make people suspect all politicians.
Well, look, I wish we were talking about other things. We've
I think he might do as well.
Things to say yesterday about the cost of living crisis and energy bills and so on. I think the problem with these things, if you take these different stories together, is that it's very easy for the public to conclude they're all the same, they're all in it for themselves. I do think it's pretty extraordinary if someone who was running to be the chairman ends up acting as a broker to help the Prime Minister of the day out of whatever financial difficulties he was in.
Pat McFadden speaking there. Sam, I guess it was kind of echoing that point about people's trust in the media, in politicians, just in the institutions of the country generally.
That's right. And in the bit that you just heard, your question was, do you think the BBC is impartial, like all of those stories? His answer, Pat McFadden, the Labour front bench's answer was, I'm not here to talk about the BBC. And then he gave that answer about Richard Sharp. And as I say, I just think it's a tragedy that he couldn't say yes. But unfortunately, people will draw their own conclusions as a result of the Sunday Times reporting. I have to say, Gabriel Pogrund, Harry York, fantastic journalists who have had hit after hit that have shaped and redefined our politics. So credible reporting from the Sunday Times, denials, it has to be said, from Boris Johnson, but institutions taking a hit. And another thing is linking all of these different strands, Sophie, which is you might wonder, when things go wrong in government or when people try and push the boundaries, isn't there some kind of institutional pushback? Isn't there somebody who's ought to be holding the ring and going, stop, no, you shouldn't be doing that, Boris Johnson? And the answer is yes, there is. And that's the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case. And whether it's the Nadeem Zahawi story about tax or whether it's the story about Richard Sharp. What's interesting is that Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, is at the centre of the discussion of both of those. He appears to have been aware of both issues. And I think in the past, you might have expected the Cabinet Secretary to perhaps somehow stop these things. He doesn't have the formal power to do it, but Cabinet Secretaries, experienced mandarins, always have a way, or they could just resign if they think things are happening that are downright unethical. But he has been at the heart of all of this all the way along. The question is, I suppose, has he become a facilitator for bad behaviour down the years as he was appointed as Cabinet Secretary by Boris Johnson and is Cabinet Secretary under Rishi Sunak? So I think a lot of heat and light perhaps heading towards him. I note that Rachel Johnson, elsewhere on the airwaves, Boris Johnson's sister, has basically said you all ought to ask Simon Case exactly what was going on all the way through. If he says things are OK, aren't they OK? I really think that Simon Case is going to be facing quite a few questions. But no, institutions are facing knocks, they're suffering bruises, and it's just probably not that good for anyone.
Elsewhere on the airways, I love how delicately you put that, Sam. The other thing that this had made me think back to your work that you've done on the Westminster Accounts project as well. You know, when there is this deep scepticism about money, about Westminster, about the motivations of MPs, and the work that you've done, and Sky and taught us as well, to effectively put donations, put outside earnings as transparently as possible and as publicly available as possible. Do you think that actually may conversely help restore some faith in politics?
I mean, I think so, and I hope so. But the thing that stands out with that is the stories that our Sunday Times colleague are writing about and the affairs to do with Nadeem Zahawi. None of that is transparent. It doesn't appear on any public register. It isn't declared. And so I think one of the conclusions I drew from the Westminster Accounts project, which was looking at a certain slice of how money works in our politics, particularly to do with MPs, is that we just don't have the whole picture. And this morning is a brilliant example of what the whole picture might look like. But we just don't really know because we don't have access to this information. And it seems that, again, the Cabinet Secretary thinks that not putting more things in the public domain is the right course when it comes to money. And I think that's where the corrosion and lack of public trust might come from. But no, the very firm conclusion from the Westminster Accounts first round was that we only know a certain amount about what goes on. And although politicians talk about transparency, love to talk about transparency, when we talk back to them about it and ask them questions about what that transparency actually amounts to, they're just less keen.
Now, there is one other thing that I do want to show you from this show earlier. We haven't got much time left, but it's about the strikes. And I was talking to the United General Secretary, Sharon Graham, on why she believes, she would say so, this government would disagree, there is a hesitance to give NHS staff the pay rise that they're asking for.
This employer, being the government, is not interested in doing a deal as far as the NHS is concerned. And I have to say, we are concluding now that there must be a much more sinister reason for this, because this level of self-harm is unprecedented. The public are crying out. I came here in a cab this morning and the cab driver was saying, why don't they just give a pay rise to the NHS? Everybody wants that to happen. It's almost like there is another reason for them doing what they're doing, because it's total incompetence otherwise.
What do you think that reason is then?
Well, I think that they are looking to privatise the NHS. Genuinely, I believe that they're looking as this is the moment they can privatise the NHS. I said when I was on your programme the last time that I was very concerned about the Chancellor, who was the health secretary, who wanted the NHS in the American trade deal. And there was a big fight about making sure it wasn't in the American trade deal. There is something unusual going on here, that they will not come to the table. There are choices that can be made that means we can pay for this. There is not a problem about paying. We're the 5th richest country in the world. There is something going on here. Otherwise, they are at a level of incompetence not known.
Sharon Graham there. She certainly had a Weetabix this morning. She accused the government of lying. She said, as you just heard, that they were deliberately running down the NHS so that they could privatise it. Sam, my main takeaway was it really feels like the two sides in this dispute are an awfully long way away from a deal.
Exactly. Look, I think she says that the reason there hasn't been a settlement is either because the government is lying or because of massive incompetence or because that they've got a sinister agenda to privatise the NHS. I think there might be just another explanation, which is that the government don't want to settle on the terms that Unite want. They don't think that they can afford it. They think it would stoke inflation and they think politically they can tough it out. I mean, we'll find out in time whether that calculation by Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt and other ministers is the right one. There is a separate conversation about the future of the NHS. Ministers, of course, would deny that they're going to privatise it. There are some prominent Conservatives like Sajid Javid coming out and talking about some quite big reforms like charging to go and see your GP. Rishi Sunak in the leadership contest talked about charging if you missed a GP appointment, although he subsequently dropped that as a policy proposal. I think you can join the dots, but I'd be tempted not to at the moment because just as it stands, you have, probably the government just not wanting to settle on Unite's terms.
And that will mean more strikes to come. Sam, thank you very much for your analysis, as always, this morning. Well, that is it from Sophy Ridge on Sunday this morning. We'll be back on Wednesday for The Take, 9 p.m. at Sky News. Will Nadeem Zahawi still be there? We'll find out.
This is Sky News. It's 10 o'clock.